could never have imagined that that cold, foggy morning would change my life forever. The reason Mark and I decided to sail to that forgotten spot in the sea was not adventure or curiosity, but necessity. The village where we lived was going through hard times, and the waters nearby were no longer so generous. We needed a good day's fishing to support our families, so we opted to try our luck in deeper, less exploited waters, where we heard the fish were still plentiful. The morning mist enveloped our small boat like a veil that hid both danger and promise, and as we pulled away from the shore, an uneasy silence fell between Mark and me. There was something in the air, a tension we couldn't ignore, a feeling that something was out of place. Sometimes life seems to pull you in unexpected directions, paths you swear you'd never take. And that morning, as the fog slowly dissipated to reveal the vast, restless ocean before us, I felt deep down that we were heading for something unknown and, perhaps, undesirable. Mark tried to keep his spirits up, telling jokes to break the silence, but his words were lost in the sound of the waves crashing against the hull. The closer we got to our destination, the heavier the air became, as if the sea itself was warning us to turn back. But necessity is a cruel master, and we had no choice but to continue. As soon as the fog cleared completely, our nets finally touched something solid. With an effort that seemed more difficult than usual, we hoisted up the net, and among the fish we were expecting, we found something that definitely didn't belong in the sea. It was a strange relic, dark and covered in algae and marine sediment. It was about 1 meter long, heavy, with inscriptions that none of us could decipher. They looked like ancient symbols, perhaps from Viking times or even older. Mark was the first to touch it, hesitantly. The relic was unusually cold to the touch, even for something that had come from the depths of the sea. The cold seemed to go deep into the skin, a coldness that wasn't just physical, but touched the soul. I felt a chill as I watched him touch the object, and an inexplicable fear began to settle in my heart. Maybe we should throw it back, I suggested, trying to hide the unease in my voice. Mark, however, was fascinated, almost hypnotized by the piece, "Look at that, John. That's got to be worth something, right? Maybe it's our luck changing." He was trying to be optimistic, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. Against better judgment, we decided to keep the relic on board. It was a decision I would come to regret in the hours that followed. As the day progressed, a sense of unease grew inside me, fueled by every glance I cast at that strange, sea-soaked artifact. As the day turned into afternoon, a subtle but unmistakable change began to manifest itself around us. The sky, which until then had been a dull gray, began to darken rapidly as if a storm was brewing on the horizon. However, there was no storm forecast for that day, and the boat's radio confirmed this with a disturbing silence. The waves began to grow, crashing against the boat with more force, and the wind howled as if laden with warnings. Then, the equipment began to fail. First, it was the GPS, flashing before going out completely. Then the lights began to flicker, turning off and on for no apparent reason. Mark was trying to fix the wires, muttering to himself about the boat's old age, but something in his quick movements and frequent glances at the relic showed that he too felt there was more going on. Meanwhile, I began to hear whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sounds were very specific, as if someone was talking right next to me. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was imploring, almost painful. I looked around, searching for a source of the whispers, but there was only the sea and the sky, which were now merging into a single dark mass. Mark, noticing my growing unease, finally stopped fiddling with the equipment and looked at me. "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief that I wasn't alone in that experience, but also a renewed fear. We weren't just dealing with technical problems. Something else was going on. Something inexplicable and terrifying. As the afternoon turned to evening, the situation on board only got worse. We decided to anchor right there, not far from where we had found the relic, hoping that the morning would bring some clarity or at least some calm. But the ocean had other plans. The waves grew more and more furious, as if they were trying to swallow our little boat, and the sound of them crashing against the hull was deafening. During the night, the phenomena we had begun to experience intensified. The lights continued to flash erratically, and now even the boat's engine began to fail for no reason. We tried several times to contact the coast with our radio, but all we got was static. And the whispers. Not only did they continue, they became clearer. They were now distinct voices, whispering words that I still didn't understand, but which filled the air with a cold, desperate urgency. I couldn't sleep, and from what I could see, neither could Mark. Sitting in the corner of the cabin, he watched the relic with a fixed gaze. I could see in his eyes the same fear I felt, but there was also a kind of fascination, as if part of him still believed that this could be a blessing in disguise. But deep down, I knew that we had brought something terrible into our world. At a certain point in the night, I began to see figures in the dark waters around the boat. They were just shadows at first, moving quickly beneath the waves. But the more I looked, the more formed they became. Human figures, pale and distorted, swimming around the boat, their empty eyes fixed on us. Every glance out to sea brought a new terror, and I knew that Mark saw them too, as their whispers mingled with the voices that filled the night. As the night deepened, it became clear that we were completely isolated, with no communication with the coast and surrounded by an increasingly hostile sea. The feeling of loneliness was oppressive. The radio emitted only static, and every attempt to restart the GPS or the engine failed, leaving us at the mercy of whatever was happening. John, my friend and fishing partner for so many years, began to change. He was talking in voices that only he could hear, arguing with the air about decisions that made no sense to me. I watched him, trying to reach him, trying to bring him back to his senses, but he was becoming more and more distant, lost in a dialogue that only he understood. On closer inspection of the boat, looking for anything that might explain or solve our situation, I discovered deep marks on the hull below the waterline. They were like claws carved into the wood and metal, as if some huge creature had tried to climb aboard. This discovery only increased the terror we felt, as there was no logical explanation for such marks in the middle of the ocean. The night was long and torturous. John was increasingly consumed by his visions and conversations with the unseen, and I was desperately trying to maintain some sense of reality. The psychological terror was relentless. Every shadow seemed to move, every wave crashing against the boat seemed like a warning, and the voices, those incessant whispering voices, gave us no respite. We were trapped, not just physically by the sea, but mentally by this inexplicable horror we had unleashed. As the night progressed, my struggle to maintain some control over the situation became more desperate. In a moment of lucidity or perhaps desperation, I tried to throw the relic back into the sea, hoping that by getting rid of it, we could also get rid of the horror that had engulfed us. However, every attempt to move the relic was futile. It seemed to have become heavier, as if the sea itself wanted it on board, refusing to take it back. It soon became clear that the relic was not only physically attached to the boat, but also seemed to have taken root in some inexplicable way. Every time I tried to pull it away, a new outbreak of supernatural phenomena occurred. The lights flashed violently and the wind howled even louder, as if furious at my audacity. The apparitions we had seen in the waters around the boat began to manifest themselves more physically. Pale, drenched figures emerged, dragging themselves across the deck with unsteady, desperate movements. They didn't speak, but their blank stares were worse than any screams. Mark and I recoiled at each appearance, too horrified to think clearly. To make matters worse, the relic began to influence the environment itself. The sea around the boat raged, forming whirlpools and gigantic waves that threatened to swallow us up at any moment. It was as if the relic was calling something from the bottom of the ocean, something ancient and terrible, which responded to its call with fury and power. The physical terror of the waves and the psychological terror of the apparitions combined to create a nightmare from which it seemed impossible to wake up. That endless night, as chaos reigned around our small boat, I could see a horrible transformation happening to John. He began to talk in a delirious way, saying that he was the guardian of the relic, that he had been chosen to protect it. His words were confused, but the conviction in his voice was clear and frightening. He seemed completely possessed by the will of the relic, as if his mind no longer belonged to him. Meanwhile, I was injured. One of the apparitions had touched me, and its icy hand had left a burn on my skin, a mark that stung and hurt more than any wound I had ever felt. I tried to stay conscious, tried to think of a way to save us, but the fear and pain were overwhelming me, and I felt my strength leaving me. The horror culminated when blood from my wound began to drip onto the deck, next to the relic. To my amazement and terror, the blood seemed to feed the relic, which emitted a dark, pulsating glow. The apparitions around the boat became more frantic, as if the blood had awakened their fervor even more. They were now more visible, more corporeal, as if they were being brought into our reality by the relic's energy. The creatures of the sea, those shadows that once swam around the boat, began to emerge more clearly. Their eyes glowed with a cold light, and their open mouths revealed serrated teeth. They weren't simply visions or shadows. They were real as the fear we felt. They surrounded the boat, singing in voices that were not human, a sad and threatening song that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean. On that night of absolute terror, with the boat surrounded by sea creatures and John driven mad, I knew I had to try something, anything to escape. In a moment of clear desperation, I decided that my only chance would be to jump into the sea and swim as fast as possible away from the boat, in the hope of reaching some shipping lane or being found by another ship. I gathered all my remaining strength, and taking advantage of a moment when John was distracted talking to the relic, I ran towards the edge of the boat. The sea was rough and the waves were crashing hard, but the fear of the creatures around was less than the terror of staying on board. As soon as I set foot in the icy water, I felt the waves try to pull me back to the boat, as if the ocean itself was under the relic's command. John, sensing my attempt to escape, shouted something unintelligible and ran after me. His expression was no longer that of a concerned friend. It was that of an enraged guardian, completely possessed by the role he believed he had to fulfill. He tried to grab me, his hands closing in a painful grip, but I managed to break free and dive into the waves, swimming with all my might. The sea raged even more violently, as if trying to stop me from escaping. Huge waves pulled me under as I struggled to keep my head above water. However, something stronger than the waves pulled me back into the boat. It was as if invisible hands grabbed my ankles, dragging me back to the deck. There, completely exhausted and powerless, I was confronted again by John, who pulled me in with a strength I didn't know he possessed. As John dragged me back onto the deck of the boat, I could barely comprehend the situation. The surrounding creatures, more visible and threatening than ever, watched my every move with glowing, hungry eyes. John, speaking in an almost mystical delirium, proclaimed that we were part of the sea now, that the relic had chosen us to be its guardians. His words sounded like those of a man lost in the depths of a distorted belief, far from the reality we knew. With every word John uttered, it seemed that the surrounding shadows intensified, drawing ever closer to the boat. I, wounded and powerless, realized that the fight was almost over. There was no fighting whatever was controlling John and the supernatural forces around us. The relic, now emitting a constant dark glow, seemed to consume not only the light around it, but our very souls. In a final moment of lucidity, or perhaps desperation, I realized that there was no escape. The entities of the sea had completely surrounded the boat, their voices forming a sad and disturbing chorus that seemed to celebrate our final fate. John, completely lost in his new role, no longer seemed to recognize the dangerous situation we were in. Or perhaps in the back of his possessed mind, he had already accepted the end a long time ago. The last hours of that night passed in a whirlwind of sights and sounds that I could barely make out. As dawn approached, a strange calm took over the atmosphere. The sea calmed its furious waves, the creatures retreated into the depths, and the relic stopped glowing, as if satisfied with the chaos it had caused. John and I, now just shadows of our former selves, felt our energies and essences being drained away, leaving us empty. Part of the sea, part of something much older and more terrible. When dawn finally broke over the horizon, it found the boat adrift, rocking gently on the calm waters that had just before been roaring with indescribable terror. John and I were exhausted, almost lifeless, staring at the sunrise with empty eyes. The relic, which during the night had seemed to be the source of all evil, lay silently beside us, inert as if it had never possessed any power. The damage to the boat was clear. Deep marks and scratches covered the hull, silent testimony to the night's struggle. Inside me, the pain of the wounds and the weight of last night were almost unbearable. The silence between John and me was profound. Neither of us had the words to describe or fully understand what had happened. We were each lost in our own thoughts, contemplating the shadows of what might still be lurking in the depths below. There were no more voices, no movement in the waters, just the gentle sound of the waves crashing against the boat. The feeling of isolation was oppressive, almost tangible, as if we were the only living beings in a vast, desolate ocean. We didn't know what the future held, nor if there would be a future for us after everything we had experienced. Now, as I recount these events, I realize that something inside us was left in that sea that night, something we can never get back. And while the sun rose, bathing everything in a reassuring golden light, the darkness inside us remained, a grim reminder that certain things once awakened can never be completely forgotten or left behind.